Hi, everyone. Welcome to WaterNow's virtual workshop, Building Capacity in Frontline Communities Through Partnerships. This is our fourth installment in our Water Webinar Wednesday series. I'm Caroline Cook, the Policy Director for WaterNow, and we are delighted that you've joined us today. So before we get started on our program, I just want to quickly review some of the functionality of the Zoom. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you've got the chat icon where you can ask your content-related questions. Do keep in mind that your messages can be seen by everyone. And we will have time at the toward the end of our program to field those questions with the panel. And if you have any tech issues, you can put those in the chat as well. And my colleague, Jesse, who's running the back end here, will be able to help you. You'll also be able to raise your hand during the Q&A and ask your question out loud. So to do that, click the reaction button and then the raise hand option there that you can see. And we will be recording, as you might have seen, today's discussion. So we'll be sure to share the link with everyone following today's discussion. So speaking of which, we've got a great panel this morning. Our speakers and our discussion facilitators are April Engel, Policy Director for River Network, Shar Habibi, Research and Policy Director for In the Public Interest, Megan Rogolis, the Schuylkill Action Network Manager with Partnership for Delaware Estuary, and Allison Aminto, Source Water Protection Program Manager with Philadelphia Water Department. And for today's agenda, first, I'll briefly provide an overview of WaterNow. Then I'll turn it over to April to talk with us about the building blocks of trust. From there, we'll hear from Shar about the differences between partnership and privatization and some of the things to look out for when considering public-private partnerships. Next, Megan and Allison will share their partnership strategies to protect drinking water. And then following these overviews, we'll have a lightning round breakout discussion to engage in smaller groups and hear from you all on the topic of partnership and capacity building. And more on the breakouts in a few minutes. And of course, we'll have time at the end for questions. One last housekeeping item. We would love to hear your feedback about today's program. So please do fill out the survey at the close of the webinar, and we'll put the link in the chat to make it super easy for you all. So without further ado, for those viewers who aren't familiar with our organization, WaterNow is a nonprofit network of local water decision makers advancing sustainable, affordable, equitable, and climate resilient water solutions across the One Water spectrum. And so sustainable is a term that has many meanings. And for WaterNow, it means providing safe, healthy, and affordable water services for people while preserving the integrity of water resources and the environment for future generations. And equity is also a term that can mean different things for different groups. For WaterNow, it means universal access to secure, affordable, safe, and healthy drinking water and wastewater and stormwater management services, and where equitable water infrastructure investment should support the long-term sustainability of our waterways, water systems, and utilities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to April.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks everyone for having me here today to share the highlights of River Network and WaterNow Alliance's Building Blocks of Trust tool and how it can be used to build lasting partnerships between community organizations and water utilities. Next slide, please. So quickly, a little bit about me and River Network if you aren't familiar with us. I'm April Engel, and I'm the Policy Director at River Network. And River Network supports a network of organizations all across the country that are working for healthy rivers and clean water at the local, state, and national levels. And our work is structured around 3 different strategic areas. So the first one is clean, safe, affordable drinking water. The second is resilient cities and communities. And the third is healthy rivers. We deliver the support by providing one-on-one technical and financial support and facilitation, by providing access to experts, by providing up-to-date relevant information. We organize a river rally conference. We facilitate peer-to-peer exchanges. We author publications and provide a website that has a plethora of resources and information. So next slide, please. So to begin, just a little bit of context about why we created this tool and its intersections with water, climate change, resilience, and equity. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the impacts of failing water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as climate change, flooding, drought, storms, they're not evenly distributed across communities. Low-income communities, communities of color, the elderly, and recent immigrants are disproportionately impacted by flooding, drought, poor water quality, and unsafe drinking water, unfortunately. And redlining is one example of a system where inequities were created by limiting access to capital and investments in communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. And the legacy of that disinvestment continues today. Multiple studies now show us that historical redlining is associated with many modern-day environmental impacts, including increased flooding, contaminated drinking water, fewer parks and trees, more heat impacts, and lower air quality. And we all are working within these systems and structures that have inequities built into them. And these inequities are impacting people's access to safe and affordable drinking water, their access to reliable sewage treatment, and it impacts the way we manage stormwater, the way we build community resilience and support adaptation. And our decisions can perpetuate inequity, or we can use approaches that address those inequities. And an engaged community and engaged community members is really central to addressing these inequities. And we have seen that partnerships between utilities and community organizations and leaders is a really key way forward by supporting community members to lead with their knowledge and their lived experience, and to use that knowledge and lived experience to develop better solutions together, as well as the ability to be strong advocates for community-generated solutions. The next slide, please. As we move through the workshop today, you may also want to consider this framework. This comes from the International Association of Public Participation's Community Engagement Continuum. And it can be helpful to consider how we might be able to move our work more towards the right end of the spectrum, more towards collaboration and empowerment, which is vital to ensuring that our efforts are equitable, that we don't leave behind members of our communities, and that we advance solutions that work for the community without causing unintended consequences or additional harm. So next slide, please. And that's the context for why we created this tool focused on building trust-based partnerships between water utilities and community organizations. Repeatedly, we've heard that to ensure that we all have access to clean, safe, affordable drinking water, that our communities are resilient to climate change, that the rivers that we all rely on are healthy, that we're going to need utilities to take action, because utilities make many key decisions and deliver key services for our communities related to these issues. And similarly, we've heard from utilities who have successfully partnered with community members and community organizations that they were able to make faster and more equitable progress through partnerships with the community. So with the support of a grant from Spring Point Partners, River Network, and WaterNow Alliance set out to find community organizations and water utilities around the country who form those successful partnerships and learn from them what it takes. And in the report, we share what we learned from these successful partnerships and hope that these lessons can help catalyze even more of these really vital partnerships for healthier rivers and communities. Next slide, please. In the report, we highlight 8 best practices and building blocks for each of the practices on how they are successfully implemented. We see these practices as a constellation where a utility and community group can begin where they are. So it's not necessarily a linear process where you start with one practice and you work your way through all of them, and at the end you have trust. It's really about picking the ones where you are and working on those, and then finding what the next one is and then working on that. So next slide, please. To give you one example of one of the 8 practices in this tool, one of the practices is cultivating long-term community relationships with intention. And accompanying this practice is a set of building blocks for that practice. Some are specific to the utility, some are specific to the community group, and some apply to both entities. So for example, with cultivating long-term community relationships, it's recommended that water utilities create avenues to elevate community members as leaders in the utility's efforts aimed at meeting the community's needs. And it's recommended that community groups include water utilities in their organization's regular communications and outreach. And it's recommended that both entities attend each other's events and find ways to create personal connections between individuals, both in the utility and the community group. Next slide, please. In the report, we share case studies of how different practices and building blocks are carried out in real-world circumstances. So, for example, we highlight this example from Tucson, Arizona, where of course water is scarce and temperatures can be really scorching, and especially in urban heat islands, which disproportionately affect poor neighborhoods with fewer trees and more concrete. The partnership between Tucson Water and the Sonora Environmental Research Institute, or SERI for short, which is a community-based organization that's dedicated to unbiased research to disadvantaged and marginalized communities to solve their environmental challenges and build healthy and safe neighborhoods. And together, SERI and Tucson Water are working to assist families with limited incomes to conserve water, install green stormwater infrastructure, and plant and sustain trees that provide shade, that cool people's homes, help improve air quality, and can help reduce energy use and energy bills. Tucson Water created a residential rainwater harvesting rebate program, which provides rebates up to $2,000 to single-family residential and small commercial customers for both passive and active rainwater harvesting systems. And that's to help both address water conservation and stormwater management goals, as well as goals around increasing tree canopy and reducing the effects of heat. So, but the issue was that for homeowners who may not be able to afford those upfront costs that come along with a rebate program related to implementing these rainwater harvesting systems, Tucson Water partnered with SERI to offer a low-income rainwater harvesting grant and loan program and provide grants up to $400 and loans of up to $2,000 to make rainwater harvesting more accessible to residents with lower incomes. And because SERI staff have built relationships and have relationships with community members and have a track record of working with residents already on improving energy efficiency, Tucson Water, wanted to expand the support SERI provides to residents and enable them to be able to include rainwater harvesting and planting trees. And that really made sense for them and their partnership. And it also aligned with, again, their Million Tree initiative by providing a non-metered source of water for newly planted trees to help with their survival. And this relationship between SERI and Tucson Water, it grew slowly and has helped both organizations over time reach their goals and grow their impact. So next slide, please. Following the development of the Building Blocks of Trust tool, again with support from Spring Point partners, WaterNow and River Network began to work with water utilities and community organizations who want to better connect with each other and build skills and leadership needed for more trusting relationships. We've now worked with 2 cohorts of these partnerships, and the initiative involves each pair identifying which building blocks of trust they want to focus on developing, and then River Network and WaterNow provide training, support, connections to additional resources, and convening the groups together to dive deeper into the practices that are of common interest between the groups, as well as providing financial support to the organizations to support them carrying out the project and to support their participation. And then additionally, we've been presenting on these building blocks of trust to groups like this webinar today, and other groups of leaders in professional associations and leadership programs. And we hope to continue to be able to share these practices with more leaders who want to advance water equity and equitable resilience in their communities. So next slide, please. So just to conclude, I invite you to consider how these trust building practices could help advance your work and what that might look like, and what opportunities and challenges you would foresee in applying the practices, and really look forward to having more discussion about that later on in the webinar today. So thank you, and I will now turn it over to Shar.
Great, thank you so much, April. Hi everyone, I'm Shara Habibi, and I am the Research and Policy Director for In the Public Interest. In the Public Interest is a nonprofit research and policy center that studies public goods and privatization. And one of the issues that, that we examine is water. So I want to talk about another type of partnership, the public-private partnership. And while private entities may have roles in some water systems, some of these arrangements can carry risks. So I'll quickly discuss some of those issues and then some of the alternatives in this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we jump in, let's make sure that we're all on the same page regarding definitions. So at the bottom of this slide, you'll see kind of at the bottom of the arrow, you'll see that we start with full public control. So this is a continuum. So at the bottom, we're starting with full public control, meaning that the public entity owns, operates, maintains the water system, and funds and finances any improvements. So they have all the responsibility, and they have all the ownership, and they have all the control. Moving up in terms of private control, the next level is outsourcing services associated with the system, such as billing. And then moving up more, a system may contract out the actual operations and maintenance of the system. The levels of private control continue to increase until we see a concession type contract. So that's where you see concession / DBFOM. And that basically allows a private entity to have full control of the system for what is typically a decades-long contract. The public entity still technically owns the system, but the private entity is running the system and controlling the system. And in exchange, the public entity is given an upfront payment. And these types of arrangements are usually like what is, when you hear the word public-private partnership, or sometimes it's called P3, that's the type of, that's the type of arrangement that, that people are typically referring to. At the very top of the continuum, you'll see kind of a full sale of the water system to a private entity, meaning that the public entity is no longer involved in any aspect of the system, no longer retains any ownership. And so I just want to note the term public-private partnership is sometimes used very loosely, sometimes used in very different contexts to describe a variety of contracting relationships. As I said, in a lot of articles that you read, typically P3 will be used in the water context to describe that concession type agreement. But I just wanted to make sure that we kind of had a common understanding of some of these types of contracting arrangements. Next slide, please. So what are some of the risks of public-private partnerships? So the first risk is loss of public control. We have seen contracts that really restrict the public entity from making important decisions about the utility for the life of the contract. So for example, we've seen clauses that ultimately protect a company's revenue. So there's contracts where the company is guaranteed to be paid for a minimum number of gallons of water, regardless of how much water users actually use. And then the public entity is on the hook for this difference. And so not only does this represent a risky liability for the public entity, but provisions like this can rub against public interest goals such as water conservation. There's also been extensive documentation of the impacts of privatization on water rates that show that households typically pay more for water provided by private corporations. There was a 2005 study that surveyed the 500 largest water systems in the US and found that on average, private water systems charge typical households 59% more than local governments did for drinking water service. There was also a GAO report last year in 2021 that had similar conclusions. And then because private entities must be profitable and show value to their shareholders, they may be less willing or able to implement robust customer affordability programs. And I'll also mention that one of the reasons why rates may be higher in some of these types of arrangements is that the cost of capital for improvements to the system when it's financed by a private entity, in many cases has been higher than what the public entity could have secured. And those costs then are of course passed on through rate increases. And then lastly, we also see that actually not lastly, but we also see that private entities may reduce operating costs through measures such as reducing wages and benefits of staff, reducing the number of staff, using inferior materials. And then lastly, one of the things that we've seen in many of these deals is a lack of transparency. So information that would be, available to the public is no longer available to the public. I think like the bottom line here is that the devil's in the details, and it's really important to look at a contract proposal instead of relying on corporate marketing materials. We have seen situations where the private corporation says, it won't raise rates. It says this kind of in their marketing materials, but the contract actually says that it won't raise rates for like the first 3 years, or they say that they won't reduce the workforce, but then there are provisions in the contract that allow them to gradually reduce the workforce. So really the devil's in the details. Make sure you understand those details. Next slide, please. So there's some specific conditions or early signs that a system might be a target for a public-private partnership arrangement. Some of these issues, are that private water corporations, they look at them as opportunities for their targeting. So the first is infrastructure issues. Is the system experiencing major quality issues? Is it under a consent decree? Are there significant billing concerns? This allows a private corporation to market their services as a way to fix these problems. Also, budget deficits or like large pension liabilities may have a locality looking for cash. And we've seen some public entities enter into P3 arrangements in an effort to secure cash quickly, even though it's ultimately a risky deal in the long term. Water corporations do tend to cultivate privatization champions within the governmental entity. So if a mayor or other decision maker is suddenly floating ideas about privatization of the system, it may be that corporations have been meeting and targeting the system. And then lastly, if other systems in the region have been targeted or are signing contracts, there's a good chance that the corporation will be coming to your jurisdiction soon. Next slide, please. So when jurisdictions are facing some of those issues, there may be alternatives to a public-private partnership, namely the public-public partnership. And public-public partnerships employ kind of 3 basic strategies to leverage the capacity of cooperating public utilities to increase efficiency, reduce operating and capital costs, and lower the prices for consumers. So the first way is that 2 or more smaller utilities can band together in purchasing or service partnerships to capture the benefits of like bulk purchasing or economies of scale for operating and maintenance costs. The second is that nearby small utility systems can also partner to invest in infrastructure that can be shared between the systems. So for example, rather than building 2 smaller water tanks, nearby utilities can share a larger water tank that can lower the total investment cost for both utilities. And then a third way is that public utilities can partner more with more efficient public utilities, or team up with community and non-governmental organizations or their own employees to cut costs and creatively address those inefficiencies. And these types of partnerships allow the combined expertise of the community, of technicians, of engineers, of frontline employees to really maximize efficiencies and reduce costs. Next slide, please. So I think I've gone through a lot of information in a short period of time, but a lot of this is discussed in a publication that we have called About Understanding and Evaluating Infrastructure Public-Private Partnerships in the Water Sector. And there's a link there, and there is also, you can easily find this on our website in thepublicinterest.org. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Megan and Allison.
All right, thank you, Shar. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Allison Aminto. I am the Source Water Protection Program Manager at the Philadelphia Water Department.
And my name is Megan Morgalis. I'm the Schuylkill Action Network Manager at the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary.
Thank you. And we're excited to be here today to talk about how we work together through the Schuylkill Action Network Partnership. Next slide, please. Great. So I'm going to start with some quick background information on the Philadelphia Water Department, or PWD. So part of PWD's mission is to sustain and enhance the region's watersheds. And one way this is accomplished is through stormwater and wastewater management. But additionally, PWD works farther upstream in its source watersheds to protect the drinking water supplies. So for purposes of this talk, we're focusing on drinking water protection. And PWD has 3 surface water treatment plants, and they produce a combined total of more than 300 million gallons per day of safe drinking water. And this is delivered to our 1.6 million residents of Philadelphia. Our largest water treatment plant is supplied by the Delaware River, and the remaining 2 treatment plants are supplied by the Schuylkill River. So together, these 2 rivers create a contributing watershed area of about 10,000 square miles, and this is all upstream of Philadelphia's drinking water intakes. Next slide, please. Okay, so taking a closer look at the geography of the contributing area. On the map to the left side of the slide, you'll see the full extent of our source watersheds. The green shading is the Delaware River watershed, and the river itself runs down the middle between Pennsylvania's eastern border and New Jersey's western border. In yellow is the Schuylkill River watershed. It covers 2,000 square miles and 11 counties. The Schuylkill River runs about 135 miles long and is the single largest tributary to the Delaware River. So at the very bottom of the Schuylkill watershed is the city of Philadelphia, which is outlined in black. So moving over to the right side of the slide, we'll take a closer look at the Schuylkill watershed in terms of land cover. The forested area is shown in green, and that makes up about 40% of the watershed. And you can see heavy concentrations of the forested land in the upper watershed. In the middle watershed, you'll see gold and yellow areas, which represent cover crops and pastures respectively. So about 30% of the watershed is used for agriculture. Generally speaking, as we move farther southeast, we'll see more pink and reds, and the darker the shading, it indicates a greater intensity of development. So roughly 25% of the watershed area is developed. Next slide, please. So the land cover overview I just went through is part of the data that PWD used in its Schuylkill River source water assessment. So the goal of this assessment was to identify and prioritize both existing and potential sources of water pollution. So considering the land cover and other supporting data, this assessment ultimately concluded that the upper watershed was heavily influenced by drainage from abandoned mining operations, and this is a primary source of metals to the Schuylkill River. The middle watershed was impacted by non-point source pollution from agricultural operations, and this was a major source of pathogens like cryptosporidium into the river. And then finally, stormwater runoff was identified as a priority source of water quality impairment in the suburban and urban areas of the lower watershed. Now, this, of course, is a simplification for purposes of the presentation, but this assessment allowed PWD to identify focus areas to inform a targeted watershed management approach. And that being said, less than 2% of the watershed area is actually within the jurisdiction of the city of Philadelphia. So a partnership approach is really required for us to move from assessment to action. Next slide, please. So the need for a partnership approach drove the formation of the Schuylkill Action Network, or SAN, nearly 20 years ago. Conceptually, the SAN is based on the building block of trust to highlight shared goals to leverage multiple benefits. So we were able to get strong interest in establishing and maintaining a partnership network from stakeholders that all had the same goal of protecting the health of the Schuylkill River. So PWD worked with the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, our regional EPA office, the Delaware River Basin Commission, and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to establish the stakeholder collaborative. And this was all kickstarted by an EPA implementation grant. So just some high-level examples of benefits from the collaboration include drinking water protection, recreational opportunities and access, aquatic life and habitat preservation, fishable waters, and improved scenic value. So with a variety of environmental benefits, we're able to capture a larger stakeholder base. And the SAN continues to grow and now hosts more than 100 different partners. So broadly speaking, these partners include, but are not limited to, other water suppliers, regulatory agencies, conservation districts, and nonprofit organizations. Next slide, please. So another building block of trust, cultivating a long-term community partnership with intention. This is one of the objectives behind the organizational structure of the SAN. So the SAN needed a sustainable structure to be able to address this wide range of needs and accommodate a diverse stakeholder group. So starting from the bottom of the hierarchy, the SAN hosts specific work groups to address these focus areas. And these work groups currently include abandoned mine drainage, agriculture, pathogens and point sources, engagement and stewardship, and stormwater. So many of the work group chairs are involved in the planning committee, and this group provides a forum for collaborative decision-making for initiatives like strategic planning. And the planning committee reports up to the executive steering committee, or ESC, and this group helps inform the overall direction of the collaborative. And the ESC is comprised of leaders from the partner organizations, and this helps maintain partner buy-in and engagement. And operationally speaking, we have a SAN manager who is mission critical to keep all these different pieces of the SAN moving forward. So with that said, I'll turn it over to our current SAN manager, Megan Regalis.
Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing the story of the SAN's establishment and its structure. I now get probably maybe the more fun task, if we want to label it that way, of highlighting some of the successful projects of our partners and tying them in with the building blocks of trust. And I'll start with the cultivating long-term community relationships with intention. So through the SAN strategic planning process, our partners develop common goals to work toward over a 5-year period that culminates in the projects that I'll share as some examples briefly today. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the SAN's partners in the abandoned mine drainage work group in the upper reaches of our watershed in Schuylkill County. These photos show before and after construction of the Silver Creek treatment system. For decades, Acid and metal-laden water from the Silver Creek mine flowed into Silver Creek and then to the Schuylkill River until our abandoned mine drainage group worked to install a treatment system comprising the 5 pools shown on the right. I'm not going to get into like the technical details of this, but construction of this project was completed in 2010. And over a decade later, we're continuing to see dramatic improvements in dissolved metals, notably iron, and an improvement in pH levels by comparing samples collected at the inflow of the system, kind of on the far right of that photo, versus the outflow at the far left. And we have these data thanks to our long-term engaged partners, specifically through sampling and ongoing maintenance efforts that are completed by Schuylkill Headwaters Association and Schuylkill Conservation District, analysis support from Aqua, one of our core water utility partners in their lab, and some funding provided by Philadelphia Water Department to provide support for shipping of these samples to Aqua's lab. So these long-term data might not be continually generated without the ongoing support and commitment of these partners. And in addition, there's ongoing engagement opportunities at this site with interpretive signage there and its use as a stop on tours of the area. Next slide, please. I'm moving downstream now in the watershed, and the next kind of project or case study is an opportunity to highlight some collaboration among our sand work groups. So specifically, this project that I'm going to talk about is a collaboration between our engagement and stewardship work group and our stormwater work groups, who formed a committee to focus on stormwater education in Upper Merion Township. Upper Merion is a stormwater work group member and a close suburb of Philadelphia, housing a large mall complex that has acres of impervious surface and multiple inlets where some dumping was occurring, and there was both a lack of awareness about stormwater and an enforcement issue for the municipality. This problem isn't unique to the area, but due to the scale of the site, it provided an opportunity to focus efforts of these 2 work groups and developed a multi-pronged approach to educate and connect people to the Schuylkill River and watershed as a resource via a series of litter cleanups throughout the township, a storm drain marking program, as you can see on that left photo there, with specifically branded decals installed at local schools in the mall property, a storm drain art contest featured in the middle photo there, designed by school students, installing stream signage on state-owned roads in the area, and culminating in an Earth Week mixer and workshop for businesses within and surrounding the mall property to provide both networking and an opportunity for engagement on good housekeeping practices related to stormwater management. Next slide, please. I'm continuing further downstream with these case studies, and we'll focus on highlighting shared goals to leverage multiple benefits from here on out. So this project site is in Philadelphia, which we don't typically associate with a lot of agricultural impacts or opportunities, but we leaned heavily on the knowledge transfer from our agricultural work group partners, mostly upstream in the watershed. And this slide is another before and after and shows just one example of a before and after at Northwestern Stables in Philadelphia. Multiple improvements were made on this site to stabilize animal use areas, improve the site drainage, and divert stormwater around areas where animals congregate, resulting in less sediment being transported, pathogens, and nutrient pollution that was discharging to the Wissahickon Creek, a major tributary, and ultimately to the Schuylkill. In addition to the water quality benefits, we see a myriad of benefits at this site. It has improved climate resiliency at this site. The site now recovers more quickly from flooding that we are seeing with more frequent and intense storms. These paddocks shown here were flooded by tropical storms shortly after these improvements were made, with waters rising up to basically that upper level of the fence, and were drained again within 24 hours. And able for the animals to be used. So the stable managers see the benefits to animal health in their operation with reduced animal manure contact and more outdoor time possible post storms with these improvements that have been made. This project was funded by a special funding resource we have in the watershed as well, thanks to our partners, the Schuylkill River Restoration Fund that I'll talk more on shortly, and leveraged several additional funding sources. And as an additional benefit for community engagement, our SAN partners host the Schuylkill River Restoration Fund grant announcement and project tour annually, which was hosted at this site, Northwestern Stables, in 2021. Next slide, please. The Schuylkill River Restoration Fund, which I mentioned briefly earlier, is another example of shared goals leveraging multiple benefits. This project was established this fund was established in 2006, and it awards grants to projects providing water quality improvements for Schuylkill River. It provides an opportunity for these funders listed here to combine their resources to accomplish their shared watershed protection goals. And since its inception, more than $4.6 million in funding has been distributed through this fund and has been leveraged with about $5 million in additional funds to improve the Schuylkill watershed. Next slide. So in conclusion, to briefly touch upon the SAN and our partners and all their great efforts over the nearly 20 years since it has been established, the Schuylkill Action Network has grown into a collaborative network of over 100 partners, as Allison mentioned earlier. Our partners share and leverage resources and technical expertise to improve water quality, magnifying each organization's individual impact. And thanks to very committed and engaged utility partners, there's been steadfast funding for the administration of this network. We have 2 to 3 staff working on SAN coordination efforts. I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Catherine Evers and Kristen Cooney, who are on the call today, and thank them both for their ongoing support in the administration of this program. And we're also fortunate to have steadfast on the ground project funding via the ongoing support of our funders for the Schuylkill River Restoration Fund. The SAN network provides a unified opportunity for branded events and outreach materials that help improve engagement across the watershed that faces a range of pressures and impacts. So that concludes our kind of overview of the SAN. We should have time for questions following breakout sessions, but just wanted to thank again WaterNow Alliance and River Network for including the SAN in this report and the opportunity to share about the SAN and all of our incredible partners. And thank you all for joining in today's discussion. I'll pass it back to Caroline.
Thanks so much, Megan and Allison and Shar and April for those overviews. I really appreciate it. Before we turn to our small group discussions, I just want to mention where you can find all these resources. We put some links in the chat, but you can also access these materials as well as others in WaterNow's toolkit. We'll put the link to that in the chat as well. But to note on the building blocks of trust piece, if you want to jump to the next slide, this lives in our Frontline Communities module. And so this section also includes additional resources on identifying utility capacity challenges and ways to identify the partners that can help meet those challenges. And then on the benefits of publicly owned water systems side, you can find those in this dedicated toolkit section that covers a variety of issues around the material that Shar covered, as well as some best practices when entering into service contracts with private companies, which is that last module there, you'll see. And then with that, we are now going to shift to our lightning round breakout discussions. And so I say lightning round because we've got about 10 minutes for the breakouts, which always go very quickly. And we encourage everyone to share their perspectives on 2 questions. First, what does partnership mean to you? And second, have community water service provider partnerships added capacity for your community? Why or why not might that be the case? And then what has that added capacity looked like? Project implementation, connecting with additional stakeholders, strategic planning, or other issues. And we'll put these in the chat so you can refer to them during the breakouts as well. And so speaking of the breakout rooms, Jesse is going to randomly assign everyone to a breakout, and our speakers will serve as the facilitators for those rooms. And so to get there, there should be a blue join button that pop up on your screen, which you should see now. So you can click that and it will take you to your respective room. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for participating in those discussions. And for those who are mid-sentence, I know it's always a little abrupt to come back to the main room. And if you were mid-sentence, sorry about that. But I know we had a great discussion in my room, and it'd be great to hear from some of our panel and facilitators on how the discussions went. So April, maybe I'll call on you first to share out from your group a minute or so.
Yeah, it was great to hear from a number of folks in room one about the really great ways in which utilities and community groups are partnering. We heard from someone who works with CH in Housing Partners in Cleveland and is working with partnering with the sewer board on answering questions and providing support to community members on their sewer bills, on their sewer service. We heard from folks that are working in rural, low income, and also small communities, and providing assistance and thinking about how can we get community members engaged in that support. Also helping communities find funding and what that looks like when community members are involved. And then also a really great example of a community group that formed based on one concern that provided the infrastructure and the relationships in place to be able to address other concerns like flooding and climate change and sea level rise that came up earlier. So sort of start where you can, and then you kind of can be able to shift to address other needs in the community later. So those are all great examples that were shared in our group.
Excellent. Thanks so much, April. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of overlap in the conversation that we had as well on types of partnerships and leveraging trusted community members as messengers, and working with customers to both upgrade and build out systems in need of expansion or repair. So Megan or Allison, it'd be great to hear from you all as well on what your group covered.
Yeah, well, there was some overlap in our group as well, but it was really interesting to hear the diversity of environmental issues that people are facing and addressing with partnerships. We had a lot of different good examples of case studies from across the country, from Colorado, how a coalition works together to plan and address wildfires. Other programs, I think the Cleveland program was already mentioned, and the California brought up in the Tahoe Basin, their partnership. They kind of mentioned the value that a well-managed small system can provide, and it's not just larger systems, that small systems too have the technical assistance to really contribute to a partnership. We also touched on that there are some opportunities in some regions for more utility engagement to reach different audiences and potentially correct misinformation.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like everyone had a good opportunity to dig in to some of these issues that we've been covering today. And I encourage you all to check out those additional resources. But as we wrap up, I know we're a little bit over our hour, but one quick reminder to please, first, if you're not already a member of WaterNow, we invite our utility folks to sign up. It's free and provides access to additional resources and support. And one last reminder here to please fill out the webinar survey. The link is in the chat there. We'd love to hear about how we're doing on these programs. Always looking to make the content more relevant and available to you. And on that note, that is our time for today. We hope this was useful. We really appreciate our wonderful panel for joining us, and to you all, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.